Welcome to another episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. Today, Kenji and I are going to be talking about all things midterm rentals, and we're going to be talking about some of the basic things that people need to know if they're interested in investing in real estate with midterm rentals specifically. Now, midterm rentals are a category that's gotten a lot more popular in the last few years in our community. I would say the last 3 to 4 years, they've really taken off, and that's partially because they have some of the benefits of short-term rentals and the higher cash and cash possibility. And so people really tend to like midterm rentals. So we wanted to spend at least one episode focusing on some of the basics you need to know to be able to operate a profitable midterm rental.
Yeah, midterm rentals have really gotten popular in our group. And I think it was because as they were thinking about how can they increase income on their long-term rentals, they were like, well, maybe I can get a different tenant who pays more, and you can actually charge more for a midterm rental because these are shorter stays. They're kind of like short-term rentals, but they're longer than short-term rentals, typically 30 to 60 to 90 days. But because they're renting shorter term and because they're renting a furnished rental, you can actually charge more than a regular renter for the same exact place.
Yeah, so what we oftentimes see in our community is people buy properties that would have worked as a long-term rental. Maybe it's a duplex, maybe a fourplex. And, they're kind of rental grade finishes for a normal, like a B-class property. And what they're doing is they're upgrading the finishes, they're furnishing the property, and then they're renting it to different tenant groups that are renting for 30 or 60 or 90 days. And then they're able to really maximize that income, but they're buying these properties that really could have worked as long-term rentals. So all of a sudden they're in a situation where they have a lot more profit than they would have if they were going and buying really fancy rental and turning it into a short-term rental, for example.
Now, I did want to say that midterm rentals, the concept of it has been around for a long time. So early in my investing, as early as 2006, I was actually furnishing rentals back then and renting them out to people from Microsoft and different corporate rentals because I live right next to the Gates Foundation and Microsoft and Amazon. And so I was able to rent it out to people who are coming in to places like Amazon and Microsoft and working there just for a short period of time. And so this was like a corporate rental. And back then there was no concept of short-term rentals. Airbnb was actually founded in 2008. So this was even before Airbnb. And so back then it was like furnished rentals or unfurnished rentals, and furnished rentals tended to get you more rent. And that's why a number of us back then were furnishing our units. And now 25 years later, it's really become very, very popular and now has its own category called midterm rentals.
Yeah, so let's start out by covering some of those basics that people need to know about. So number one is cash and cash return. And we've kind of alluded to that, but the cash and cash return that people are oftentimes getting in our community is 20% plus. Again, because they're buying these properties that would have worked as like a long-term rental with a 12-month tenant, but all of a sudden they're having a lot more turnover and people are staying in a place that's furnished. So now they have a lot more amenities so they can charge more. So oftentimes in our community, we're seeing people be able to charge maybe Airbnb rates or even 1.5 times the long-term rental rate. And so they're getting more cash out of the same property. And so the cash and cash return calculator that we often use for the midterm rentals is the long-term rental cash and cash. But we often need to make sure that we're not forgetting to include things like landscaping and internet, for example, if you're paying for that. There's a lot of more costs that you oftentimes pay with furnished rentals that you need to make sure that you're not missing out when you're doing the cash and cash calculations.
Yeah, definitely more revenue, but more expenses as well, which we can dive into. But I did want to talk about the calculator, and we have a long-term rental calculator and a short-term rental calculator. And so you could really use either one, but personally, I like using the long-term rental calculator just because it's much easier to come up with the revenue. The short-term rental calculator includes something called average daily rate and occupancy rate, and that can be a little bit tricky to calculate. But with the long-term rental calculator, it's very easy to come up with what will be the monthly rent that you're going to be charging a midterm tenant versus a long-term tenant. So it's very easy to come up with that number. And that's one of the reasons why I like using the long-term rental cash-on-cash calculator for midterm rentals.
Yeah, and we'll put links to the long-term rental and short-term rental cash and cash calculator under this podcast so you can link to ours and download them. But I think one other important thing to note is when we run that long-term rental cash and cash calculator for our midterm rental, we increase the amount of vacancy because you're probably not just going to have, a week of vacancy a year. You're probably going to have a little bit more, and you want to build that into your assumptions. Now, what we see in practice is a lot of people actually, their midterm rentals are booked all the time. But again, when we do those calculations, we want to be conservative. And so we do bake in more vacancy. And one of the questions I'm sure people are thinking is like, where am I going to get these numbers from? we always triangulate data in our community. So we go and we look online, we look at what other offerings are out there, what other midterm rentals are at, what are they renting for. But then we can also talk to property managers. Not many property managers have knowledge of midterm rentals or really have any sort of experience with midterm rentals. So it can be a little bit more challenging sometimes. So sometimes you just got to test it, right? You got to put it out there for more than you would for a long-term rental, see how quickly it books, and then maybe next time you increase it if it was really easy. And so there is some element of testing because there's not the property management knowledge out there with midterm rentals that you see with short-term rentals or with long-term rentals.
Yeah, and something that we talk a lot about in our community is risk mitigation, right? You don't want to take risks and buy a property hoping that it's going to work as a midterm rental. So what a lot of people in our community do is they'll buy a long-term rental, they make sure the numbers work as a long-term rental. And let's say it's a duplex or a fourplex, then they'll actually convert one unit at a time as a midterm rental to see how it goes. And we've had instances where somebody had a fourplex, they took one of their units and they were able to make 50% more, even 75% more than the long-term tenant. And they were like, wow, if I furnish all 4 units, then my cash on cash is going to go through the roof. And sure enough, that's what happened. And so that's a really great way to do that. Test it in a low risk way. Another way that I think is really creative that some people in our community have done as well is they'll actually take the listing before they close on the property. They'll use virtual staging to furnish the property close to what they're going to furnish it to. And then they put it up on a listing service like Furnish Finder. And then they will see like how much demand there is, right? Will people actually pay the price that you think they will pay? And again, ideally you want to get more than a long-term renter, right? That's the reason why you're going to go out and furnish the property and incur more expenses. You have to be making more. And so you can test it out by putting out a listing out there. And, if somebody's interested, then, you're going to close soon. You just tell them, hey, it'll be available in a short period of time. So that's how some people have creatively figured out whether or not a property would work as a midterm rental.
And then we wanted to make sure that we also talked about what types of properties work well as long-term rentals. Kenji was just talking about properties that you would traditionally do for a long-term rental, and you're using them for a midterm rental instead. These are sometimes duplexes, fourplexes. We've also seen people buy larger multifamily properties that, again, would be traditionally long-term renters, an 8-plex or a 10-plex. And you can have some pieces of property as midterm rental. Even some of the larger properties that we've been syndicating more recently, they're talking about doing those as midterm rental. The key is going to be the location, right? Because if you know you're going to have a certain tenant type, you're going to have traveling nurses, then you're going to want to be close to the hospital. If you know that you're going to have corporate rentals, then you really need to understand where people are going to be coming in. We have one student who has a Texas property that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and there's a lot of people coming in to work in the oil fields, right? So there's a lot of different types of tenants who can come, but you have to understand the location that they're going to want. And so location's going to be key.
Yeah, those corporate rentals are definitely a great situation because they can actually work with the company who has all these workers come in and out, and they can have one contract. It's very easy. And then the company is responsible for keeping the units full. And what's great about that is they have 100% occupancy for long periods of time. And then they have, workers coming in. I did want to mention that you were talking about multifamily and larger properties. It really is location dependent. We have a property under contract right now that we're going to be buying soon. And it's a larger multifamily, close to 80 units. And it's right across the street from a hospital and a few blocks away from 2 other hospitals. So it is absolutely ideal for a furnished rental. And this will be great for traveling healthcare professionals. Even there's a teaching hospital right there. So it'll be great for interns and residents potentially as well, who may not rent out the property all year round. So for these types of situations where there's a strong need for corporate housing, it's ideal for midterm rentals.
Then we wanted to talk a little bit about our tenant type, which we've already been talking about. It can be ranging from, a lot of people think in healthcare about traveling nurses, right? But we've seen people also do residents, right, who are going in and doing rotations, or medical students that are doing rotations. We've seen people do insurance rentals, which are midterm rentals. So let's say you have insurance and your primary home has a pipe break and you're going to be out of your primary home for a month or 2. And so your insurance company will actually book a property and use it. You would use it as a midterm rental. And what's so cool about those cases, oftentimes they're going on Airbnb to find those properties. And so you might actually get the Airbnb short-term rental rate, but you're having a tenant who's going to be booking for a month or 2. And then what often happens, as it does with all construction, is it takes a little bit longer and then it gets extended and then you have a longer stay with your midterm rental. And again, the insurance company's footing the bill and they're paying a much higher price than you may have gotten with that average tenant.
Yeah, one of the keys with that one is that we found out over time is that if your property is in a really good school district, then you're going to have a higher likelihood of a family wanting to find a property in that school district. Let's say that they have one of their children in a really great school in a school district, and they have problems with their home, and they claim insurance, and they have to find other housing. Well, they're going to want to have a house that's right in that same school district. So that could be one potential strategy for finding these insurance clients.
And the key with all of this is going to be coming down to the relationships that you build. Now, there are some listing services you can definitely put your property out there for as a midterm rental. And you can also put it out on Zillow and places like that. But if you have some connections, within the hospital or within the medical school or with companies that do a lot of corporate workers who are coming in, that's going to help you because all of a sudden you have an in and they're going to think about you when they say, oh, I have some new potential tenants coming in. I really need to place them. Where am I going to go? So it's going to be key for you to go work on these relationships and build these relationships and make sure that people know you have a midterm rental and that it's great quality and a really great location. And it's very, very useful for them to be in that location for their work.
Now let's talk about taxes because I think that a lot of people invest in rental properties for the taxes. And so, the question is how do you get the tax benefits for a midterm rental? And it's actually very different than a short-term rental. So if you remember a short-term rental, in order to get the tax benefits, you have to have an average length of stay in the calendar year of 7 days or less. Anything above that, 8 days or more, it's going to be considered a long-term rental. So your midterm rental, if you're averaging 30, 60, 90 days, it's going to be treated as a long-term rental. So you are going to have real estate professional status in order to use the losses to offset income, active income like W-2 income or 1099 income.
I will say that you also have likelihood of having a lot higher losses with a midterm rental initially. Because when you set it up, you're going to be buying furniture, which you don't normally do with a long-term rental. So it's treated as a long-term rental, but you probably have some more additional startup expenses. So you will have more losses that first year as you buy furniture.
Mm-hmm. Another important topic, I think, is to talk about restrictions. So cities have restrictions for short-term rentals, and sometimes the definition can vary. So you really got to watch out. Sometimes they might consider a short-term rental to be something that is 30 days, 60 days, right? It just depends on the city. So you really need to kind of make sure that you understand what is their definition of a short-term rental. Now, for most cities, I would say that if there are restrictions, it's going to be 30 days or less is going to be the definition for a short-term rental. So as long as you're above 30 days, then you're going to be okay. But it's going to be something that you really need to watch out for.
Yeah, and this really kind of bleeds into the property management section because if you're having tenants stay 30 plus days or 60 plus days, you're very likely going to go into those tenant regulations and laws that the city and the state have that are relevant to long-term rentals. So you want to make sure that you understand them because, you may have to go through that eviction process. So it can be a very different feel than if you have a short-term rental, you have people staying just a couple days. You have to understand the local city regulations if you're going to be self-managing. Property management, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, there's not a lot of people doing midterm rental property management. There are some co-hosts out there. There may be some property managers who have some experience, but it's not as popular as short-term rentals. And so because of that, there's not the type of knowledge out there. So what you're going to want to do if you want to use a property manager and you're not going to want to self-manage, you're probably going to approach a number of different property managers, kind of gauge what kind of experience that they have. And also you're going to have to negotiate with them about the fees because a normal fee for a short-term rental is oftentimes 20, 25, or 30%. And I would say often more towards that 30% range. Whereas a long-term rental, oftentimes we're paying maybe 8 to 10% property management fees. And we're having, let's say the first month, we're going to be paying part of that fee to the property manager. Midterm rentals are somewhere in the middle, right? They require more work for the property manager, but they're not to the level of a short-term rental. So what the exact amount is, you're going to have to negotiate with that property manager or that co-host that you decide if you want somebody else to be managing your property. And so it's going to be a push and pull. Again, pricing may be also a little bit of testing and figuring it out. That's okay because you'll get clarity on it and you'll get those relationships with insurance companies and hospitals and all of that. And that can really help ensure that you're going to have a big flow of tenants coming in and you have a sense of what the pricing should be and you have a sense of their needs. So hopefully the property management over time becomes easier and easier.
Now, we wanted to talk about something that is, I think, one of the most important topics for midterm rentals. And that is, what do you do in between these midterm stays and how do you maximize the revenue? And one of the best ways to do that is to, in between stays, let's say you have a month in between stays, in between 3-month stays, what are you going to do? Are you going to have the property just sit there? Or something you can do, if you have the skill, you know how to do it, is you can put it up on Airbnb or VRBO and rent it as a short-term rental.
Yeah, so this is really key, is to have the skill set to be able to run short-term rentals, to be able to be a host, to understand what short-term rental guests need, what kind of amenities they're looking for, so that you serve them and that you have great reviews there too. And so what's really helpful if you're going to be doing midterm rentals is to both have the skill set required to do a long-term rental, because now you have a backup plan. Let's say you decide down the road, I don't want to run this as a midterm rental anymore. You know how to do a long-term rental, but you also have that backup plan to fill in some space with short-term rentals, maybe even get a higher amount for a short period of time. So you really want to have that flexibility, and that flexibility only comes when you have the skill set, the team members to be able to do everything in between from long-term rental to short-term rental.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of illustrate how this could work. Earlier we were talking about how you might take a long-term rental and get more revenue by furnishing it and getting these midterm tenants. But you can go the other direction too, is you could start out with a short-term rental, and then after you get the tax benefit the first year, you can turn it maybe into a midterm rental. Again, you have a furnished rental. And so turning it from a short-term rental to a long-term rental means, you typically are getting rid of the furniture. But turning it from a short-term rental to a midterm rental is very natural. Property's already furnished. And so all you're doing is going for those longer stays. And, for our short-term rental, one of the things that we did was in 1 year, we had a corporate tenant come in and rent our place for 6 weeks straight. And that was almost a $60,000 booking. And just having that property, again, we use it mostly as a short-term rental, but to be able to just open it up and get a 6-week stay was pretty incredible and great for our revenue.
Yeah, and again, you want to be thoughtful about when you get those long stays, right? Because if you are going for the short-term rental tax loophole, you're probably not going to want to do that first year, because it may bump you over that average length of stay of 7 days or more, or 7 days or less, But, the second year, like Kenji mentioned, since you've taken a lot of those tax benefits that first year when it was a short-term rental, you may not care as much. And so having that flexibility of making it a midterm rental and renting it out for several months. And we see this happen in places that are very seasonal too. Like, let's say that you're going to have a lot of short-term rental guests in the summer, but in the winter, it's a slow period. Maybe make it more of a seasonal midterm rental during the winter months. And again, this ability to know which sites to list it on, to have the team contacts and to understand the needs and what you cover and what's different about midterm rentals. It's a skill set and something very learnable, and something that a lot of people do learn in our community because they want to have that flexibility to switch from one to the other over time. Now, we wanted to give you some resources where you can learn more about midterm rentals. First of all, we actually have a course called Boost Your Cash Flow. It's actually a kind of a shorter course. We often see people taking that when they take our Zero to Freedom course or they take Accelerating Wealth. They're learning about long-term rentals, short-term rentals, and they're like, yeah, I want to have that ability to flex and to do midterm rentals too. So we'll put that link for Boost Your Cash Flow in the show notes as well, but you can find it at semiretiredmd.com.
And then if you want to learn how to turn that midterm rental into a short-term rental, or start with a short-term rental and turn it into a midterm rental, we also have a course for short-term rentals called Accelerating Wealth, and we'll put that link below as well.
And remember, when you're switching from a short-term rental, claiming those tax benefits and switching to a midterm rental, you also want to have a really good, savvy real estate CPA involved. And you want to make sure that you're thinking about your intention and if you have to talk to the IRS, what you're going to be able to say about the tax benefits and why you switched it to a midterm rental. So always a plug for working with a really great team and keeping your CPA in the loop with your tax strategies so that you do everything in compliance and you know exactly what you want to do.
So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend or give us a 5-star review. We'll see you next time.